Well, we actually got some good news out of the G7. And it's not really anything that most of the media is talking about. I mean, I guess I should amend that. People are talking about it, but they're not talking about it as good news. They're talking about it as yet another Biden gaffe, which it is. It was a terrible gaffe. He repeatedly, I guess 3 times, said the word Libya when he meant to say Syria, which, you know, yes, it's very easy to make fun of Joe Biden because he said Libya instead of Syria. The guy's not there. We know that. That's old news. That's not something that's that worth reporting on. I mean, it should be reported on. People should know that the President of the United States is not all there and that he cannot string, basic sentences together. He has a big issue with that. But what Biden was actually trying to say here is very, very good news. Something that most Americans I shouldn't say most, I should say 99.99% of Americans have no idea about, is that our country has crippling sanctions on Syria, which have done a lot to hobble the rebuilding of that country. It's very difficult for outside groups to go into Syria and try to participate in rebuilding the country and trying to provide aid to them. It's difficult for Syria to import oil. That's why they have, 1970s style gas lines, even though they are a major, Middle East oil producing nation. All of their oil wells were occupied by ISIS for years, and now they're being occupied by the United States and the Kurds. And they're not allowed to buy oil from really anyone else. The only oil they get, I think, is smuggled in from Iran. So that's a pretty slow trickle. And then you've got all these, humanitarian groups that would like to go and try and help people in Syria, but who are not allowed to because of the sanctions, because then, they will have trouble dealing with the United States. And so the U.S. has done everything they can since they couldn't topple Assad to kick dirt in the face of the Syrian people after they've been knocked down. The sanctions never hurt the leaders. It's not going to hurt Assad. Assad still lives in his same presidential palace that he's lived in since, I don't know, what was it, the late 90s? He took over that country. And so Bashar Assad and his wife and, their family, they're doing just fine. But the ordinary folks over in Syria have been put through hell for years, and that hell is being prolonged by the United States, especially since the United States, were the ones throwing gasoline on the fire to begin with when there was first the uprising against Assad. The U.S. did everything they could to fund various factions, anyone really who was against him, including our good old buddies, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, ISIS, whatever you want to call them. They're all the same guys. But based on what Biden said this weekend, it sounds like there's been a bit of a softening on that front. Because even though Biden used the name Libya, he very clearly was referring to Syria and was saying how something that he thought was an example of something that they could accomplish, him and Putin, at their upcoming meeting in Geneva on Wednesday, which is 2 days from now, was that they might be able to collaborate on sending aid to countries that have been, through civil wars like Libya. But again, it's been confirmed now he was not referring to Libya. He's referring to Syria, because Syria is a country, both Libya and Syria had civil wars that were, the direct fault of the United States government, of the Obama administration. But Russia is only involved with Syria. Russia didn't, they never really had much of a foothold in Libya. I think that they tried to play in that sandbox a little bit, but I don't think that they've been that effective. But Syria, that's those are their buddies, Assad and them. And so Russia has a lot to do with there. So it makes sense that the U.S. and Russia would collaborate on trying to help the Syrians rebuild, and by help the Syrians rebuild or collaborate, all that really has to mean is that the U.S. will stop sanctioning the rebuilding of Syria. And if that's on the table, that means pretty much that, not that it makes much of a difference, I guess, politically at this point, but it confirms that the U.S. government, if they do this, will have completely given up on trying to topple Assad, because the Sanctions on ordinary people are always predicated on the idea that, well, if we just make the lives of ordinary citizens terrible enough, they will rise up and overthrow their leader that we don't like. That's been the rationale behind the Cuban embargo, for so many decades. It's not been to try and make Castro weak. Obviously, Castro has been, was strong in Cuba until the day he died. It was supposed to make the lives of ordinary Cubans hell on earth so that they would be incentivized to try and overthrow Castro. Same thing is true with Venezuela. The sanctions on Venezuela, kicking them out of SWIFT, all this stuff that the U.S. did was to try and make the already bad situation in Venezuela even worse, to the point to where the Venezuelan people would rise up and overthrow first Chavez and now Maduro in favor of somebody like Juan Guaido. And so if Biden, is being fed talking points and note cards from his staff, talking about, letting humanitarian aid into Syria, it sounds like they are giving up on regime change in Syria for now. Which is, it's to say too little too late is the understatement of the century, but it's perhaps a glimmer of hope that maybe life in Syria doesn't have to be so bad forever. Maybe this is a sign that one day soon things will start getting better there, and the U.S. will not be working overtime to try and make life there as difficult as possible. Maybe humanitarian groups will be able to come in and help, rebuild hospitals and schools and roads and homes. Maybe they'll be able to import more oil. Maybe the Syrians will be able to get access to their oil fields again. And frankly, this would be a major achievement for any president of the United States. It would be a massive, humanitarian achievement for the U.S. to simply stop inflicting pain on one of the many countries that it has reduced to rubble, whether that be Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Syria, the list goes on. So before this, I had absolutely no expectations for anything to come out of this meeting between Biden and Putin in Geneva. I thought that maybe we might get some funny gaffes, but I'm sure all this stuff will be off the record. Biden, of course, said he would not do a joint press conference with Putin because he knows that if those two are in a room together with a camera on, it would just be disastrous, and it would be very, very fun to watch. So Biden's handlers are not letting him do that. But if we get some kind of relief for Syria out of this meeting, I would have the magnanimity to applaud Biden. Not because I think Biden is great or a good person, but because he exceeded my expectations and he's not quite as terrible of a president as I thought a week ago. He will have accomplished one good thing. He will have rolled back one terrible policy. And I will say the same thing if the Pentagon completes their withdrawal from Afghanistan without any hiccups, which is, it seems to be on track, but it's still kind of up in the air. They were supposed to be completely out of there by now. Biden already pushed that back, which I'm not happy about. I condemned that as much as possible at the time. I still condemn that. Think that it's inviting. It's just inviting for the whole situation to destabilize, and it's putting the whole peace process at risk. But I don't want to get off on a tangent. That's not the subject of this. Either way, on Wednesday, I will be keeping an eye on the Biden-Putin summit, and I will be waiting for something on Syria. Now, I think that afterwards, after Biden said this stuff, he kind of, the White House had to kind of come and roll it back, and maybe Biden wasn't supposed to talk about this. And even Biden said it while he was speaking. He said, I shouldn't be negotiating out in public like this. Like it's something to negotiate over, like not... sanctions relief for people who have been, just crushed into the dirt, allowing them to rebuild their country a little bit. That is that's like something that you use as a chip to negotiate back and forth. I mean, just the arrogance of that alone is astonishing to me and disgusting. The United States allowed Nazi Germany to rebuild. They allowed Imperial Japan to rebuild. Yet they're not going to allow little tiny Syria to rebuild without, I guess, getting something for it. They want some kind of concessions from Russia in exchange for allowing the Syrians to rebuild their country. It's disgusting, but sadly, that is the current state of affairs. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.